Why do progressives hate progress? Well, one answer could be that progress is a myth, that if you believe in progress, you are a Pangloss, a Pollyanna, you're a advocate of Chamber of Commerce, Silicon Valley, rah-rah, boardroom, optimistic capitalism. But as a matter of fact, progress can be demonstrated quantitatively. And so I think there really is an issue as to why it is so often denigrated and denied. But first, I just want to establish the premise that there is such a thing as progress. Here are some examples. If you plot war deaths per capita since the end of World War II, it's a roller coaster with some ups and downs, but the overwhelming trend is downward, and a fraction of the number of people die in war compared to the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Despite a lot of talk about a democratic recession and obvious cases such as Turkey and Russia, the overall trend of democratization, the second wave, is continuing, not at the same rate as in the 1980s, but if you add up the countries, give them a democracy score, subtract the autocracy score from the democracy score, it continues to increase across the world. Homicides have been in decline, both for the United States and the world. Life expectancy has gone up in every region, and so the shortest-lived part of the world, Africa, people live longer than people lived in the longest-lived parts of the world just a few decades ago. Extreme poverty may even vanish in the lifetimes of people in this room. The World Bank has set a target of 2030 for the elimination of extreme poverty by their definition, and that's certainly the way the world is going. 10% of the world now is estimated to be in extreme poverty. That's still 700 million people, but as you can see, not long ago, a majority of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. And this extends to many aspects of quality of the environment. This is my favorite graph on the state of the environment. I got it from the EPA website, and turns out they kind of distorted the axes to prove the point. But even if you relinearize the axes, you see that since the 1970s, while GDP has increased, number of vehicle miles traveled has increased, as the United States population, energy has increased, CO2 has started to level off. But during this entire time, the 5 major pollutants have declined. So the idea that you can have economic growth or you can have environmental improvement, but you can't have both, is directly negated by this graph. The proportion of the world's surface that is protected from economic development and exploitation has continued to increase, and the amount of carbon you have to release into the atmosphere per dollar of GDP has declined. So those are some good signs. What makes progress possible? In a forthcoming book called Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress, I argue that there are 2 big ideas that have propelled this progress over the last couple of centuries. One of them, science and reason more generally, the idea that problems are solvable given the right knowledge. And the other is humanism, that the problems that we ought to solve are how to get as many people as possible to live long, healthy, prosperous, and pleasant lives. Now, given all of these positive trends over the last 70 years, how have they been reflected in the news? Well, here's one more graph. This comes from a study of tone mapping, where an algorithm simply counts up the number of positive words like improve, good, better, versus negative words like horrific, catastrophe, crisis, worse, and so on. And the black line shows the positive versus negative tone of the New York Times from 1945 to the present. The blue line shows a digest of news media from across the world. And as you can see, during the decades in which the world has been getting better and better, the news has been getting glummer and glummer. So the question is, why has our depiction of the world and our objective measures of the world gone in opposite directions? why do intellectuals and journalists, or so many of them, deny progress? There are a couple of psychological explanations. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky many decades ago proposed that the human mind assesses risk via a shortcut they call the availability heuristic. Namely, people estimate probability according to how easily they can recall examples from memory. If you can call to mind a terrorist attack, a belching smokestack, an oil-covered seabird, then those images stay with you, and that's how you judge the state of the environment, the state of crime, the state of war. If you combine that with the nature of the news, the cliche is if it bleeds, it leads, and there are actually studies that show that that is accurate. That is, if you give a sample of newspaper editors possible stories with the content held constant, but with a positive or a negative spin, they will choose the ones with the negative spin. This interacts with another part of our psychology, sometimes called the negativity bias, summarized in the slogan, "Bad is stronger than good." Losses hurt more than gains buoy us up. Criticism stings more than praise flatters. Trauma has more lasting negative effects than good fortune has positive effects, and so on. And I think that the negativity bias creates a kind of gravitas market, namely that we are vigilant for things that go wrong, opening up a niche for people to remind us of things that have gone wrong that we may not have noticed. Tom Lehrer, the great philosopher, social critic, and satirical songwriter, said, "Always predict the worst and you'll be hailed as a prophet." The result, I think, has mixed. It is obviously a good thing if people are aware of problems, and that can motivate them to solve them. And I have many examples where simply putting a hitherto neglected social problem on the agenda can lead to measures that improve it. Violence against women is an example. That became a public issue starting in the 1970s, and indeed rates of sexual assault, rates of domestic violence went steadily downward in the decades since. On the other hand, it can also lead to a kind of cynicism that the system is so corrupt, so evil, so dysfunctional that we may as well smash the machine. We should drain the swamp. There's no hope of improvement. It is corrupted beyond redemption. And some evidence that may have had an effect in recent political events comes from this graph that plots the support for three populist movements: the votes for Donald Trump, votes for Brexit, and a composite of votes for European populist parties as a function of birth cohort. So this is not time across the x-axis, time in which the survey was taken. This is year of birth. And as you can see, populism is an old man's movement. By old man, I mean baby boomers and older. But the younger the cohort, the lower the support. Unfortunately, young people don't vote. If young people voted even a few percentage points higher rate of participation than they did, the results of these elections would be very different. And so there are many explanations, but one of them, I think, is the widespread feeling that the system is just so broken that there's no difference among candidates, that Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, what's the difference? They'll both just shore up a rotten system. And so you have a large percentage of especially younger people who either don't vote or vote for third-party candidates who have no hope of winning. There is an alternative, which I argue for in the book, three laws that I took from the physicist David Deutsch from his book, The Beginning of Infinity. Not as, don't get the blood pumping as much as a charismatic authoritarian leader, but if we could find a way of bringing this into people's consciousness as the way to approach our problems, I think we'd be better off. And that is, problems are inevitable. Problems are solvable. Solutions create new problems which can be solved in their turn. I don't think that this would easily fit on a bumper sticker or a lapel button, but if we took this attitude towards the state of the world, I think we would be better off. Thanks very much.